Yeah, we've met Jamie a few times. Thanks again, Jamie, for presenting. And over to you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. Interestingly enough, I am taking a flight and going up to a place called Sioux Lookout in Northern Ontario, where Lac Seul First Nation is really looking to do something not unsimilar to what was done in the Great Bear Project in BC. And I just comment on that because it speaks to that leadership that BC has taken, and in what we at Bluesource do a great many forest carbon projects and sort of natural climate solutions, and many with First Nations, tribal nations in the U.S. And certainly here in Canada, a lot of the First Nations look towards the Great Bear example as sort of leading the way. And so I think it's interesting from that perspective that others are looking at the developments in these markets and looking to see how they build off of the experience that the Haida and coastal First Nations built through that project. So very quickly on Bluesource. Bluesource is a project developer, so we help entities, communities, First Nations develop. We fund all of the costs related to developing carbon offsets or carbon fuel standard credits. And we do that across North America in all the major markets. And so we've got one of the largest project developer across North America, and a big focus of what we do is in forest carbon and natural climate solutions, both forest carbon and avoided conversion of grassland, where we have over 50 successful projects developed, creating or very close to creating actual monetary value to landowners. We develop projects in BC and the Columbia Climate Investment Branch, and are really excited about the opportunities that are, I think, about to be afforded across Canada as a result of these different programs. And I want to speak very high level about just that, and I know this has been touched on, but from our perspective, the advent of the federal system applying in different provinces and a federal offset system, the advent of CORSIA, the International Aviation Offset System, Clean BC and what it means in terms of required emissions reductions and what we believe is going to need offsets as part of that equation. And then fast-growing voluntary markets just affords an opportunity that, quite frankly, we have not seen in the past. BC carbon offsets have largely been sort of landlocked as a result of a sort of one dominant buyer. And I think we see the landscape going forward with all of these options, and maybe not all of these options come to fruition and offer great opportunities. But the fact that there are four compelling market options that can provide exactly what you want out of a market is possibilities, different pricing, different sources of demand. So we're very much looking forward to the future for BC and the potential to generate offsets in the province. So we did a study of what the offset potential was. I did present that in the last meeting in FNCI January. And I want to speak very specifically to a couple of those options and dig a little bit deeper. But when looking at more sort of short-term, medium-term, and long-term options, we really need to focus on what protocols exist. Protocols do take a long time, and our more short and medium-term opportunities are going to be in those categories of offsets for which there are existing offsets or offset protocols or protocols that are coming online shortly. So I know it has been mentioned, fuel switching is really the only approved protocol. And the study we did showed that there are 26 diesel power remote communities. An average capacity of 2.5 megawatts per plant, although there's quite a bit of variation. You've got as high as 12, and you have as low as 100 kilowatts. But thinking through the potential from that, you have about 110,000 tons per year of potential from switching from those diesel power plants to renewable sources. And you're hopefully using things like forest residues. These could also be wind and solar. And at that average capacity plant of 2.5 megawatts, that translates into a reduction of about 4,500 tons of CO2 per year. Valued at $25 per ton, about $110,000 per year of revenues from carbon offsets related to that project. Now that is not huge for any given project, but it's material in being able to overcome many of those barriers that currently exist to those types of fuel switching projects. So I think that's definitely a very interesting project opportunity to really go after. And that's really only related to the remote communities. There is a much larger opportunity related to fuel switching in the oil and gas sector in BC. That's in the area of about 2 million tons a year. So overall, a very significant opportunity using that protocol. The second and definitely the largest mitigation opportunity is in forest carbon. And estimating that potential is very difficult. So we do, like I mentioned, a great deal of forest carbon projects. And when we look at the potential here for offsets, we're referring largely to what we call improved forest management. So this is not tree planting. It is not afforestation and reforestation, which has a very large role to play in mitigation, but is not a project category that works particularly well with offsets. So the forest carbon opportunities are to commit to sustainable forest management and meeting a very high standard of sustainable forest management. When the common practice forestry is much more intensive, less sustainable forestry. And this is, there are a handful of projects in BC done when we had the forest carbon offset protocol, and Great Bear being the most prominent of them. So it's really a fantastic mechanism to incentivize not only sustainable forest management, but forest management that aligns more with traditional values of forest. And I think that's why a lot of the focus for people like ourselves, Bluesource and others, is in First Nations, because these require very long-term commitments in order of 100 to 130 years to maintain that level of sustainable forest management. And they require an ethos of stewardship of the land and of the forest resource that fits or aligns very well in many cases with First Nations and their stewardship of the land. So, interestingly enough, we've had a period for quite a few years where there has been no progress on that forest carbon protocol, but we're now moving very quickly towards an approved protocol. And we are in the working group that is looking at that, that's reviewing that with the BC government, and things are going very well in terms of accommodating and making a more workable protocol, but also that intends to publish that and approve it shortly. And the proposed protocol due in May. And that, I think, is a really great development, that if we see a protocol that allows for that type of project, in the span of months and not years, and we see that potentially being adopted by the federal government, for applicability in the federal system. That's going to unlock a lot of potential in BC and elsewhere in the natural climate solutions. And so that's something to really look out for in terms of unlocking offset potential. And hopefully offset potential that creates offsets that are valid in a federal system, that are valid in CORSIA, and that have high value and premiums in voluntary markets.
So, Jamie, who's
The other impending protocol that we see is in organic waste management. So these are largely landfill organics diversion. And interestingly enough, although it is an offset, protocol under development, this is an area where we feel offsets are unlikely to generate much potential in and of themselves. The reason for that is because in BC we have a low carbon fuel standard, which incentivizes clean fuels and particularly incentivizes renewable natural gas that's recovered from organic waste. And the pricing in that market is in the $185 per ton of CO2 range, far in excess of what an offset is worth. And so I think we're going to see a lot of emissions reductions in that category, but we're going to see it under the low carbon fuel standard market and under the current voluntary market for green gas that exists in BC over the forests program, and much less so in actual offsets. And that's something just to really keep in our minds, because the low carbon fuel standard, where you're generating clean fuels, and then potentially in the future where you're generating emissions reduction in the upstream production of fuels, you're potentially accessing this much higher value market for greenhouse gas emissions. So maybe just to conclude, I think we're seeing the markets provide for opportunities for higher pricing and to move the type of volumes. We're seeing those really emerge quickly and with options. And that provides the basis for generating projects. And I think the focus has to be on fuel switching, on forest carbon, on those things that can produce credits under the low carbon fuel standard. And then looking to the future, but that's going to take more time because we'll need to develop protocols, are other things related to more industrial sources of emissions reductions and direct air capture, for example. So I'll probably leave it there.
Thank you, Jamie.
I have a question, I think
Yeah.
Linda does.
Yeah, Jamie, I was just wondering, the Great Bear Rainforest forest credits, they went into the voluntary market. Do you know who bought them, or? Who wants to answer that?
So I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
Who bought the voluntary credits out of Great Bear?
You can go on the BC registry and see, a lot of details. That's all publicly available. The vast majority of emissions reductions have gone to the climate investment branch in BC.
Oh, so it's been
There have been voluntary sales to other entities, airlines, cosmetics companies, but they've been in extremely small volumes.
Two parts to the deal. Offsetters took a bit, but they moved into Europe.
Yep.
And the vast bulk of them went to the CIB.
To cover government emissions for travel and.
I'm not sure I heard that. I didn't hear the question, but.
The vast majority went to BC to cover its own emissions issues.
It's carbon neutral. It's mandated carbon neutral target.
Right.
What is the demand now, Chris, or anybody else, for carbon neutrality by the government this year? I mean, it was, I think, around 1 million tons a year back in the day, but what is it now?
Yeah, I think it's somewhere here. Generally, consistent the last couple of years. But we have plans to hopefully get it lower because we want lower emissions.
Man.
So, Jamie, my question is about your emphasis on forest management as opposed to afforestation or reforestation. And the Treaty 8 nations and BC made a presentation here twice, identifying a legacy footprint, primarily gas, but some oil production in Treaty 8. There's about 300,000 kilometers of that are not right away seismic, and about half of that is not recovering, and so there's this deficit that's creating a significant issue for Treaty 8 nations, and potentially an opportunity for, I don't know whether it's reforestation or afforestation. I think it's reforestation, but it isn't coming back naturally, and that's a pretty large area. And then in addition to that, there's disturbance, things like abandoned well pads and that sort of thing that don't come back very quickly. And if they're rehabilitated, they usually just go to grass rather than to forest. So we were thinking that an investment in reforesting those sites would add up, and it has the additional benefit of creating a benefit to the Treaty 8 nations, because that legacy footprint is a significant barrier to them being able to exercise their treaty rights. And if we're trying to get alignment between the nations on shifting policy direction, it can't be at the expense of, their territory. So I don't understand why what I've just described as an opportunity doesn't seem to be an opportunity from your analysis.
It is an opportunity. What I mentioned is it's not afforestation and reforestation is not a mitigation opportunity that works particularly well under an offsets framework. So to give you an example, in California, we've had a protocol that allows for afforestation and reforestation for 8 years now, and there's not a single project. And the reason for that is because there's a significant upfront cost in seedlings and planting, and offsets are generated under that technology 20, 30 years on when there's sufficient growth in the tree. So it's front-end loaded in costs and back-end loaded in revenues. So that's why offsets has not worked well for that. But other forms of carbon finance can work very well for that. BC has the Forest Carbon Initiative, which is oriented very much to reforestation. The federal government is putting a great deal of resources, or not that they are putting a lot of resources into afforestation, reforestation. So there are absolutely opportunities for carbon finance to go towards reforestation. Offsets just probably isn't the right mechanism for that.
Okay, thank you.
Even President Trump likes
The one term.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe there's a caveat to that, and that would be about the types of trees you're planting and how fast they grow. So what we see is that reforestation projects do work for tropical regions where you have fast-growing eucalyptus type trees and whatnot, because they can generate those carbon masses quickly. So, but maybe it is about then adjusting the protocol to allow for slower growing forestry mass. But I do know that we have some fast-growing biomass in Canada, in the boreals, particularly the poplar species that are often used for pulping in the industry, and that's often what they're replanting. So, I wouldn't discount it either, Alex. I think it's still an opportunity there, but in terms of the cost, maybe amortized cost is going to be higher than a forest management project. Yeah, okay, maybe it's a higher one. But what I also see is that these projects are often combined. So let's hedge our risk like any project portfolio. Let's do the high cost ones with the low cost ones, and in this case the fast growing carbon with the existing carbon. And you blend a forest project with forest management, an element of reforestation, and maybe even an element of afforestation. So, yeah.
And that's a really good point. I think I would totally agree, where you see where reforestation and enhanced reforestation is part of a larger forest management project, I think can really work. And one of the really exciting areas, as climate change is impacting the resiliency of our forests to pests and forest fires, is for forest carbon projects and revenues from those to go back into managing our forests to make them more resilient, which in turn creates, sequesters more carbon, generates more offsets and more revenue. There's sort of a virtuous cycle, I think, that can also respond to some of the threats that our forests are facing.
Virtuous cycle, I was thinking about what's the phrase, to put virtuous cycle on one of your beautiful
Yeah,
visual
so-
things, which we haven't even talked about yet, but should we talk about it? Not right now, but are you going to talk about the?
Yeah, we are going to talk, we're going to talk about them tomorrow. I'm not sure how many people are coming tomorrow that are here today, but just one more word on the previous conversation. And it's more like a virtuous synergy in that, what it is that FNCI is exploring through these scenarios, the potential to create net zero LNG and other gas products as a means for poverty alleviation in the First Nations communities. And what does the policy environment need to look like in order to enable that to happen? And what does the political environment need to look like in order for that to happen? In the sense that, if more disturbance in their backyard, which has already gotten to proportions that they can't tolerate, that's not going to create the alignment that creates the political will. It just creates more conflict. And the same is with the carrier nations who have experienced the mountain pine beetle and have a big deficit. So we were exploring forest-based carbon solutions as a way to both mitigate climate change and sequester carbon dioxide and help to put investment into the restoration of the lands of those nations so that they become supportive of the scenario overall, even though they aren't necessarily direct beneficiaries of the production of the gas downstream of the LNG. They're pipeline benefit agreement nations, they're involved in production upstream, but they're overall concerned about the deterioration of land. So we're trying to, and they're involved in many of them. Jim Webb's still on the line. He would say West Moberly owns 2 restoration companies, and so who's going to do the restoration work? It's probably going to be their businesses. So if we could kind of make that all fit together, then it creates this alignment that's beneficial and ultimately political. Anyway, stealing a little thunder from tomorrow morning, but some of you may not be there.
Well, and I think that actually after we do take a legitimate coffee break, there are some other key stories related to that from a few of our final kind of experts around this whole discussion session before we go back into, well, I guess go into the BC stock take. Rob, back to you after that. So are we, Jamie, thank you so much, and I hope you catch a flight. Have a safe one.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie.